hear the word domain name, you may be thinking of something like google.com or yahoo.com. In a Windows domain context, domain name doesn't refer to an internet domain name, but rather a record that all the computers and all of the user accounts use to look up resources within the domain. I could enter something like google.com as my root domain name. However, anytime somebody within the domain tried to access something with the domain name google.com, the computer would think that that is a resource within the domain. I can't use something that's on the internet because then my users would not be able to access that internet web address. Instead, we should use a domain name that doesn't exist on the internet and isn't used anywhere else within our domain as a web resource or any other type of resource. A good practice to use is always using something that does not exist on the internet, and the best practice is to use something that ends in .local, because .local addresses cannot exist on a public domain namespace. So I'm going to use the domain name test.local. Next, we'll set our forest and domain functional levels. The functional level of a forest, or a domain, is simply a set of features that is allowed on that domain as a whole. This is mainly controlled by what versions of Windows Server are active domain controllers within your domain. For example, if all of my servers within the domain were Windows Server 2012 R2, then I could easily set my forest and domain functional level to Windows Server 2012 R2. There are additional considerations to make if you're using older versions of Windows Server. Your forest or domain functional level may need to be set lower. Since this is the only domain controller in our domain, the default works just fine. We're also asked to specify this domain controller's capabilities. We want this domain controller to be a DNS server. We'll describe more about DNS servers later, but basically it's simply a record of all the computers and devices within the domain network and their IP addresses that are associated with them. A global catalog is simply a record of all of the resources that exist on the domain controller and are advertised to all the users and computers based on their permissions. The primary domain controller that we're setting up now has to be a global catalog because it's the first domain controller. You'll also see that the read-only domain controller is grayed out and you cannot enable it. This is because the first primary domain controller is being set up and needs to be writable. Later, you could set up a domain controller that is read-only for special purposes. Lastly, we need to set up a directory services restore mode password. DSRM is a tool that's used to recover directory services and directory information in case of a disaster. So we'll set up a password for that now. Make sure you note this down in case you ever need it in the future. When you first set up a primary domain controller in a basic domain, you'll be warned that delegation for the DNS server cannot be created because of an authoritative parent zone not being able to be found. This is normal and it can be ignored. Next, we'll be asked to set the NetBIOS domain name. NetBIOS is simply the first part of the root domain name that we set. We want this to be the same, so the default is perfect. Next, we'll be asked to specify the location of the ADDS database, or the Active Directory Domain Services database, the log files, and the sysvol folder. The defaults for these folders are fine, but in more advanced lessons you can learn to modify the locations of these to suit your purposes. We'll leave the We're then given an option to review all of our selections and to make sure that everything looks correct. When we click Next, Windows Server will begin checking to make sure that all of the prerequisites for becoming a domain controller are met. It will give you warnings in case anything needs to be brought attention. The first item is a warning about security. There is a setting in Windows 2012 domain controllers, by default, that is turned on, that allows compatibility and cryptography with older Windows Server systems. This is a potential security risk because older cryptography algorithms are sometimes weaker and subject to vulnerability. We'll ignore this for now, but it is a good thing to read up on the different vulnerabilities that might exist when you're warned about them. We'll also see that the warning we got earlier about DNS server is showing up as well. As before, this warning can be ignored. We'll see that all of our prerequisite checks have been completed and they have all passed successfully. We're ready to upgrade this server and promote it to a domain controller. Once the server has successfully installed Active Directory domain services and upgraded to a domain controller, we'll be warned that we're about to be signed out and the computer will restart. Once our server has restarted, it is now a primary domain controller on the test domain. We can now log in as our administrator account and the server manager window will open. From here, we can configure our domain services and add other roles and features onto our domain controller. At the very bottom of your server manager, you'll see that AD/DS has been installed, as well as DNS and file and storage services. In the next few lectures, you'll learn how to configure these services as well as add others. So now that our server is now a domain controller and we've installed Active Directory domain services, we now have to configure Active Directory. Well, what is Active Directory? It is the foundation of the Windows domain. It's essentially a catalog of all the registered objects in the domain, and it provides authentication services and security principles that allow those users and computers to access the resources that they've been granted permissions to. So we're going to start with a real-world scenario. We're going to provide some realistic examples of how Active Directory might be set up, and we're going to go through and actually configure it as if we were starting fresh for a real business. So we're going to be working with the imaginary CarMax dealership. It has one headquarters location and 2 sales locations. The headquarters has an administrative department, accounting, and HR, and then the 2 locations have sales staff, mechanic staff, and management. So we're going to go into Active Directory, set up these different objects, and go from there. So back in our server, with the server manager window open, we'll go up into the top right hand corner to Tools. Then we'll click Active Directory, Users and Computers to open that snap-in. On the left-hand side of ADUC, or Active Directory Users and Computers, you'll see our test.local domain. If we expand that, we'll see some of the built-in OUs, or organizational units. Start with the biggest division or biggest organizational structure unit that we can think of and then work smaller. So for our business, we'll start with our 3 locations. We've got a headquarters and 2 sales locations. So with our domain selected, we'll right-click in the middle of the screen, then click New, Organizational Unit. And we'll give it a name. For instance, Headquarters. And we'll repeat that step for the other 2 locations. Now before I click New, I have the Headquarters OU selected. So right now I'm creating new objects within this OU. If I want to create an OU inside the root domain, I'll have to click that first. So I'll create 2 more organizational units, and we'll call our 2 sales locations CarMax East and CarMax West. From here, following our rule, we'll go to the next largest group of objects that we're going to put into Active Directory. Personally, I like to take each OU and separate them into users and computers, since that's going to be the most common object in our Active Directory structure. So for each location, I'm going to select it. Make sure you name each one individually, so when you're looking at it on an individual basis, you know which one it is. So with this structure, I can put my users into headquarters and the computers at headquarters into the computers-headquarters OU. I'll repeat this for the next 2 organizational units. So now I have 3 OUs, our headquarters location, and our 2 sales locations, and a sub-OU for each groups in each location. So starting with headquarters, here's where we can set up our departments for each location. Now when we're talking about departments, or small groups of users like that, we need to consider what kind of things those people are going to need to access. When we're talking about security principles like that, whether it's accessing a file share or access to a printer, we want to base that on a user basis and a group basis. Commonly in businesses, accounting and administrative people have access to different sets of resources. So in our headquarters location, we're going to set up a user group for each of our departments. In our headquarters group selected, we'll right-click and then create a new group. New group. We'll give the group a name. We'll make sure that the security group type is enabled, and we'll make sure that it is a global group. Then click OK. We'll repeat this step for the other 2 departments that we have at our headquarters location. Accounting, and HR. So now our headquarters location has a place for computers, a place for users, and separate groups of users that correspond to the different departments at that location. Now we also need to create our departments for our sales locations. Now keep in mind, within a domain, you can't have 2 groups with the same name, even if they're in different organizational units. So it's best practice, like with our computers group that we have, or the computers OU under each location, to also append an individual or unique name to a group, if it's specific to this OU. So we'll do sales at CM East. Make sure that it's a security group and a global group. And we'll repeat that for the other 2. So now I have 3 user groups at that sales location, and since none of them have just the management, mechanics, or sales name, I can create the other 3 groups with CM West, so there's no conflicts. So now we have our basic Active Directory structure created. The only thing that we're missing is some users. So we'll put in some dummy users, and you can use whatever usernames that you'd like, or whatever names you'd like, as long as you remember to create one user that you'll want to use when you log in under an Active Directory account. So in headquarters, I'm going to create one user, new user, give him a name, and create a username or a user logon name. It's best to always have a naming convention for both computers, users, and as we've created, OUs and groups. I like to use first initial, last name, but you can use whatever you want. We'll set a password for our user. And since we have the user must change password at next logon, when this user first logs on with the password that you've set, they'll be prompted to create a new one. Now our John Jones user that we've created is a member of the administrative department, so we need to add him to that group. We'll right-click, select Add to Group, and the Select Groups window will open. Whenever we see this window, all we're doing is we're selecting the name of the object that we want to add to. We selected John Jones and we clicked Add to Group. So right now we're looking for groups within the test.local domain that we want to add John Jones or whichever users we've selected to. So we're going to enter administrative and we're going to click check name. Looks like it found the group because it underlined it, and we'll click OK. The add to group operation is members to see that John Jones has been added, modifying their permissions. If I administrative,